All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Tucker. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an educator here at Wenatchee River Institute. Just a quick show of hands. Is this anybody's first time at a Wenatchee River Institute program? Awesome, cool. Yeah, well, thanks for being here. Wenatchee River Institute, we're a nonprofit with the mission to connect people, communities, and the natural world. So anything involving getting people outside, connecting to each other, connecting with nature is something that we like to be a part of. So that kind of comes in two different branches of education, our youth programs and our community programs. Our youth programs are just picking back up for the school year, even though we were busy with our summer camps this summer as well. But we've got a whole education team going to schools all throughout the region, and they come here as well for different environmental education programs. And then our community programs, the other side of it, includes all sorts of things like Red Barn events like this. We have seasonal nature walks. We have a variety of different workshops throughout the year. And there's always things going on, so make sure to check out our website for more things. And I just realized I left my paper over here, so hold on a second. So you maybe saw some of these slides here. We've got some awesome events coming up here. These are some of our ones that are coming up soon here. Tomorrow, we're partnering with Waste Loop for their sustainable living and farming tour. So we'll have a tour of our grounds and some of our gardens here. We've got our plant foraging workshop coming up in a couple weeks, and then Sunset and S'mores is kind of one of our annual gatherings to come and just celebrate with our supporters and our community here on our campus. So that's at the start of October on the 2nd. So another part of our programming is we always try to make an effort to connect to the indigenous people of this land here, and we do that by reading a land acknowledgement at the start of all of our programs. So I'm going to go ahead and read this land acknowledgement for you all. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shim-Pishquashu people. We are spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shim-Pishquashu, or Pasquosa, or Wenatchee people. The Shim-Pishquashu, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Shim-Pishquashu people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shim-Pishquashu are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shim-Pishquashu now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shim-Pishquashu people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they're connected to. Their traditional language is Inhamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and I'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language, Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the indigenous peoples of the place you call home. Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. All right, so thank you, everybody. Before we jump into our program, I do have some people and businesses to thank. So first up, I want to thank our volunteers who are helping out here tonight. We've got Lissy at the beverage station, and beverage station is still open throughout the evening if you need or if you'd like to get another drink. And then thank you also to Jeremy in the back here, who's running our tech station, making it possible for people to view this program at home, streaming it live, or to view it later. It'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And then we've also got Jackie from A Book for All Seasons over here, who's going to be selling our speaker's book there. So you can come and see her after the program if you'd like to purchase a copy or chat more about our local bookstore. Okay, and then a couple businesses and organizations that make these events possible. These are our sponsors for our Red Barn event. So if you live in town, or if you are out in town here in Leavenworth or in the area, please go support these businesses, because they support these programs and then help make it possible. So I want to call a couple of these out, or some of these out by name here, a little more than a couple. But special thanks to City of Leavenworth, North Central Washington Audubon Society, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, Ludwig's German Restaurant, Leavenworth Pine Village KOA, Icicle Brewing Company, Obertal Inn, South Restaurants, München House, Gustav's, Hotel Pension Anna, Leavenworth Chamber of Commerce, Syndicate Smith, Rhine House, Blue Elk Inn, The Nature Conservancy, Wild Birds Unlimited, Leavenworth Coffee Roasters, Leavenworth Village Inn, Sage Mountain Natural Foods, Chocolat, Barron House, Cove Resort at Fish Lake, Tierra Learning Center, Riverfront Rock Gym, and Rimmer and Ryder Construction. So thank you to those businesses for making these Red Barn events possible. We couldn't do it without them, and we couldn't also do it without your support. If you want to see more Red Barn events and more WRI programs, we do also really heavily rely on donations. So if you do feel inclined after the program, we've got a donation basket over here. It looks like some people have already donated, so thank you so much for doing that. Okay, one last thing, and then I'll get out of here. You maybe saw this scrolling through here. I'm going to pull this back up at the end of our program. We're working a little bit more within our new strategic plan to try to collect more feedback from all of our programs. So if you have a minute at the end of the evening, I'll pull this up and you can scan this QR code. It's a really short little survey just to answer a couple of questions about your experience here at the program. We'd really appreciate some feedback from that. So I will pull this up at the end. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. So, photographer, author, wildlife biologist, and tracker David Moskowitz is the author of Caribou Rainforest, Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, and Wolves in the Land of Salmon, and co-author of Peterson's Field Guide to North American Bird Nests. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Sierra, High Country News, and Audubon magazine, as well as by organizations such as the National Wildlife Federation, Endangered Species Coalition, and Nature Conservancy of Canada. Please welcome David Moskowitz.
We'll be back here for a Red Barn event and to working with Wenatchee River Institute. I live just north of here in the Methow Valley. It's good to see a few familiar faces. And so just a couple hours north of here. And once we get some visuals up here. First off, I just want to plug that I'm super excited about this book. All of the photos in the book are going to be up on scrolling through tonight, and none of the captions will, and I'm not going to talk about each photo, so if you want all the stories, they are in the book, so I encourage you to get a copy there. And it was a really awesome project to work on, and great to work with Braided River, which is a nonprofit publisher that focuses specifically on conservation stories, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Before I start running through images, this map is in the front of the book as well, and this is the Columbia River Watershed. And for me, starting this project of documenting the contemporary Columbia River watershed, it was just eye-opening to actually, I've probably seen this, maybe you guys have seen a map like this, but to really think about that, we're connected right here with Utah by water. And when you get up to the far northern end of the watershed in Canada, it's right at the other end of that watershed is going to the Arctic. Right where the water tips over, it's going to the Arctic. And so this is just a really tremendous variety out in Wyoming, part of Yellowstone National Park. It's like just a really, truly massive watershed. It's the size of France, and I would say arguably culturally far more diverse and ecologically tremendously diverse. And you'll see some images that tell that story. So that's just a little bit of the of just kind of an introduction for the place that you'll be seeing images from. And there are images in the book and stories from across, and obviously not every bit and piece of it, but from across that watershed. So, and I'm going to talk about some of the themes that were really important in guiding me as doing the photography for this, and the images are going to tell their own story. And that was one of the visions when we put together this book. Eileen Delehanty Pearkes, who wrote the introduction to the essay at the front of the book, which we call it's a biography of the Columbia River. She tells kind of an overarching story of this river, some geology, cultural history, and a little bit of the contemporary story of the river. And then the images in the book are following like a parallel track, telling different parts of that story in different ways. And as a photographer, for this project, I was really wanted to create a portfolio of images that explored what this watershed looks like today in a modern context. One of my inspirations for doing this project was realizing, like, wow, this is a backyard project for me. I like you guys, live on a tributary of the big river, the Columbia River, and I wanted to know more about it. And when I started researching, I realized there's interesting books about the history of the Columbia River. There's interesting books on like the ecological destruction that was done through converting the main stem of the river into like an industrially managed waterway. And I was like, wow, these books don't actually tell me about my experience of the Columbia River watershed. So I've been a resident of the watershed for 2.5 decades. And I've worked as a biologist and as an outdoor educator and as a photographer in places all over the watershed. And I was like, wow, this place is actually filled with a tremendous diversity of wildlife and landscapes. It's a place that I love to recreate. It's a place where people from all over the world come to recreate. And there's all these salmon that still return. I mean, a big story when you think about a lot of the stories told about the Columbia River are what it used to be like with 16 million fish, salmon coming up the river, and what it's like now with just a fraction of that. And, or just stories about endangered salmon, right? And salmon stocks, on the verge of disappearing, which is true. Like none of those are not false stories, but it's also not the complete story. And for me, I realized there's this narrative about like salmon are on the verge of extinction. And the flip side of that is these fish have survived so much, right? The fact that there are still salmon coming up these streams is actually just an absolute testament to the power of these fish and of the natural world. And I wanted to create a set of images that told all of that didn't run away from the impacts of settler colonialism on this watershed, that told the stories of the dams and the irrigation and the changes that have happened, and at the same time didn't tell a story that's just like gloom and doom, because that's not my experience of this place. It's a place filled with wonder and beauty as well. And as I dove into researching the book and starting to photograph it, most of my background as a photographer and as a photojournalist started as wildlife photography and then natural landscapes. But more and more I've been engaged in work around issues of environmental justice and the interplay between indigenous sovereignty and wildlife conservation. And so that was a natural place for me to start looking for different stories and angles to tell. And it's very simple with salmon, because all of the best success stories for salmon recovery in the Columbia River, places where there was a dip and now there's a recovery, are connected to indigenous peoples' work to regain their power to steward these landscapes. And so I started picking at, like, what are the cultural elements of this landscape? And then even within the settler colonial culture that, I consider myself a member of, I was like, wow, there's different cultural elements here too. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with that here in Leavenworth, where there's been multiple waves of settler colonialism here ongoing today. I showed up, I'm essentially an urban refugee. My parents were born in San Francisco and New York, third generation on this continent and first generation in the Columbia River watershed. And I came here because San Francisco is really beautiful, and if there wasn't 16 million other people that thought so too, I might live there. I was looking for something a little bit more wild and remote. So I started wanting to pick at and tell the stories visually of these different cultural groups that are living side by side here, sometimes happily, sometimes with some friction. And I realized as well, when I photograph wildlife, I'm trying to create images that tell the story of those animals, right? Their story. I don't want to take, my favorite images of wildlife are not images that misrepresent that animal's relationship to their landscape, right? I want to create a picture that's going to show the viewer how this animal lives in their landscape. What is their niche? What is their connection to place? And I realized, for the human element of this story, I wanted to do something similar. And so in the book, there's a series of portraits of wildlife that I created. And then alongside that, there's portraits of different people as well, which I started calling my river people portraits. And each one of these is a different person with a unique connection to, and very different connections to this watershed. Whether they're ranchers out in the Snake River watershed that are relying on water from the watershed for their crops, or indigenous fishermen, or the gentleman that operates the locks on one of the Snake River dams. All these different folks that have a unique relationship with the river, I wanted to visually give space for them to tell their story and to listen and listen to their words and watch how they interact with the river, and create a series of images that helped communicate to people what it was, what this river meant to them and what their connection was with it. With wildlife, I couldn't include their words, but with all of the people, there's quotes from these folks. I'd asked each of the folks I photographed, what does the Columbia River watershed mean to you? And gave them a chance to respond to that in different ways. And I found their answers to be profound, some of them very simple, some of them very complicated, and just a really wide variety of answers to that. So I learned a ton from that process, both as a photographer, but just as a human and a resident of this watershed. Excuse me. From the perspective of Braided River, the publisher for this book, as I mentioned, they publish 2 or 3 books a year. Each one of them is a conservation campaign. And they felt like now is the time to tell the story of the Columbia River, because we are actually at a couple pivotal moments from a conservation perspective in the watershed. And some of you, who here is familiar with the Columbia River Treaty?
Columbia River what?
Treaty. Yeah, so there's an international treaty between the United States and Canada that governs the management of the Columbia River's water. And it was signed in the middle of the 20th century. I can say that. I can't remember the exact date. But it's in the process of being renegotiated. And actually, right when we released this book, there was an announcement that there was an agreement in principle that's being circulated for review. And the original treaty, basically, it's a fascinating, picture of how our society is shifting because the original treaty saw the river as doing two things. One, producing power, and two, needing to be controlled to avoid flood damage from, so Portland is in the watershed, is in the floodplain for the Columbia River. So the whole treaty is just like, can we produce power, and how do we do that in a way that's equitable between Canada and the United States? And how do we manage the river to avoid flood damage downstream in the United States? How do we get Canadians to manage water upstream to protect Americans downstream? The original treaty didn't include any, there's no interactions with indigenous peoples on either side of the border. They were completely excluded from the negotiations, even though they're sovereign nations that have responsibilities and legal rights to access the river for salmon. The original treaty, actually the Canadians were like, we don't have a commercial fishery on the Columbia River, so we don't care what you do in that regard. And it was the doorway to allowing all of the upstream salmon to be destroyed by the Grand Coulee Dam, which was built without any salmon passage. And to this day, there's still no functional salmon passage through the Grand Coulee Dam, which got rid of salmon runs for hundreds of miles upstream and thousands of square miles of the watershed. So the new treaty, which is being renegotiated, the Canadians on their negotiating team invited the First Nations, the indigenous nations there, to have their own seat at the table. So it was actually functionally a three-way negotiation between the United States, Canada, and First Nations. And on the American side, the tribes within the borders of the United States had a advisory, they had a chance to be consulted with on the U.S. side, which was a step in a different direction than 70 years ago. But functionally what came out of that, in large part because of the demands from the First Nations and tribes, was that there's now a third rail in the new treaty, which is ecological function, right? We need to manage the river for hydropower, flood control, and ecological function, which a big part of that is salmon and anadromous fish, as well as just stream flows in general. And so this is, there's been critiques of the agreement in principle from the environmental community, but it's a huge step in a new direction. It really represents some shifting values in our society. And one of the reasons that this book we felt like was time to be commenting on these issues and taking part in the process of making sure that this treaty, which will go on for their 70 or 80 years in its current form, will reflect the values that we have, that you guys have. So that's happening right now. It's under negotiation. Eventually it'll have to be ratified by the US Congress. The other thing that's going on is that we've got a lot of endangered salmon, right? That's another issue that's actually happening, and there's ongoing conversations about whether the Snake River dams are going to stay or go or change how they're managed. We've got work, there's a coalition of indigenous peoples that are working on getting salmon above the Grand Coulee Dam. And they're working on that, and the federal government in the United States is actually being supportive of that under the Biden administration. And so there's all sorts of moving parts here. There's opportunities, and it could go a lot of different ways, whether or not there's going to be salmon here in the future. They've survived to this point. Whether they'll be here in another 70 years, we're making decisions right now about that. And then the last piece that really is timely about this is we have infrastructure, and we have learned to live as a settler colonial culture in this landscape in a different climate regime, right? And so a lot of how we relate to the river, how we manage water, how we manage ourselves in relationship to water needs to change, because how water is falling on this landscape, where, when, is changing. And that's going to affect all of the different ways that we interact with this landscape: agriculture, salmon, recreation, transport across this landscape is changing. And so it's a very pressing issue for us to be thinking about. And most of the time, folks every place I've gone all over the watershed researching, and then also sharing these events, and we'll have folks that are deeply connected to their place in the watershed and totally unaware, or very, pretty significantly unaware of what the rest of this watershed that they're connected to looks like. So one of the things I wanted to do as somebody who was amazed at all the things going on in this watershed was to bring that and show folks here in Leavenworth what it looks like in central British Columbia and out in eastern Oregon, and the folks in eastern Oregon, showing what's going on here in the North Cascades, and create a more cohesive sense of place and a shared sense of like a connected watershed. And that was a big part of my impetus for doing this project. I think the last thing I want to say, and then I would really actually love to, just engage in some conversation and see what you guys, if there's questions I can answer, is I just totally lost my thought. Yeah, I'm just going to it's going to come back to me, so I'll just let that ride. But yeah, I'm curious, what brought you guys out tonight to, hear stories or talk about the Columbia River. Oh, I know what I was going to say, is the name, Big River. And is anybody here familiar with that reference for that name for the Columbia River, Big River, the Big River? Yeah, so Big River is the translation from several different languages, indigenous languages, for what this river is called in a non-English context. So the Columbia River comes from, obviously you can trace its origins back, and actually the story of where the name Columbia comes from is in the book, but obviously it goes back to Christopher Columbus, and so it's a name completely divorced from Christopher Columbus obviously never set foot in the Columbia River watershed, and so it's a name that's really harkens back to the settler colonial, over society that, and when we think about the Columbia River and we put that name on it, it's telling a story, right? It's telling a story of settler colonialism. And so we wanted to make sure in this book and in this project, we put the settler colonial culture in a larger context. And so the name Big River, we felt like, it is a huge river. It's the 4th biggest watershed in North America. It's the biggest watershed on the West Coast. So it is just functionally a big river. But also, that's a name that reflects how local peoples have been calling this river and continue to call this river today, a translation of that. Nichiwana is the Sahaptinan translation for that. And my hope was that would also just create a mindset of stepping back and looking at the river in a new way, because we've all heard Columbia River again and again and again, but my hope was for folks that the name Big River would be like, what's that? Where's that? And give us a chance to have a new perspective on a place that we're pretty familiar with. So yeah, so with that, I would love some questions or comments or thoughts about this stuff to speak to. I've got many stories. I'm happy to tell things. Yeah, so what do you guys got?
I'm just curious what they called some of the tributaries. If you even know.
Yeah, so that would be, so one of the things that I realized very quickly in researching this book is depending on how you think about it, there are dozens of sovereign nations within the Columbia River watershed, and there are 5 main language groups, and there's a map of that in the book. But within those language groups, there's, there could be dozens of different languages within that they can't actually, if you speak one language, it doesn't mean you can speak the other, right? So if you speak Spanish, it doesn't mean you can speak Italian, right? So there's just dozens and dozens of different names for places. Some of them overlap, some of them don't. So yeah, we were working hard to figure out how to tell the story in a way that was respectful of those different place names and perspectives on the river, and really created a sense. We're going for, rather than divisions, continuity. So looking for themes that brought people together in terms of how we think about and talk about this place. Yeah?
You have some amazing wildlife photos. How long of a time span did you spend getting these? Because some of those are animals that are very reclusive.
Yes, indeed.
that are almost never ever seen.
Yes, and also very varied. So there's like a kangaroo rat, which those are down on the Columbia River around the town of Vantage, down by where I-90 crosses it. They never drink water. They live in true deserts, less than 10 inches of rain a year. And then there's wolverines, which are a boreal species that cannot reproduce unless there's, many, many feet of snow on the ground all the way through May or June, right? So totally disparate, relationships to the landscape. But I worked on this book very actively we started dreaming about the project just before COVID started. And then the book published in June, so that was like, 3 or 4 years. But some of these photos go back, and I'd say probably 75% of the images were taken in that time span. But then some of the photos go back, over a decade from previous projects. Like I said, I've been working in this watershed for many years. And then specifically for the wildlife stuff, some of those photos are me photographing animals directly, and then I also do a lot of camera trapping, where I'll set up a camera with a motion sensor, like when you go into your house at night and the light pops on when you pull in your driveway, similar type of sensor, except it takes their picture and we'll set up strobe lighting. So it's a little bit of a studio setup to do a portrait of an animal, which is why I started thinking about photographing people and animals in a similar way, because I was essentially setting up studio lighting for wildlife. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do this for people too. And we'll just have this kind of similarity in the images between the two. Yeah.
So when you talk, I'll give you a choice of two questions. when you talk to people about the Columbia River Watershed, did you find answers that were sort of in tension with each other from different groups? Yeah, so that would be one of the most interesting.
Was there tension between the groups?
In terms of like how they,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like you're saying that the original thinking of it was sort of in a very utilitarian, like keep it from flooding and use it for power sort of way, and there's still people of course who are using it for irrigation and. Great.
Yeah. So I say the answer to that question is yes and no. Mm-hmm. So the no, there was no tension, is that all the folks I interviewed were tremendously appreciative and grateful for and in love with this watershed. Like they really appreciate it. This water was very important to them. And then, yes, there was tension because the ways it was important to them varied between them to some degree. They photographed a family orchard. There's a number of photos of an orchard in the Okanagan Valley here, and then portrait of the couple that owns those orchards. And they were like, we'd have no livelihood. 4 generations on this land, and it's all irrigation water. It's like we couldn't do it without that, and it's vital. And then, of course, Lou George, who I pointed out, when I started talking about this, is an indigenous fisherman. He was like, I need to sit here. I need to be here by the river. My elders have told me, like, we need to stay here by the river to caretake these waters, for the river itself and for the salmon. And so inherent within that, there is a tension, right? Stream flows has become a big issue. Like, how do we keep enough water in the river versus how do we, maintain our rural livelihood, and like agriculture is a vital part of that. And so, there's actually when the industrialization of the river happened, I can't remember the name of the gentleman. I believe it's in Eileen's essay. There was a gentleman who's like, basically the Columbia River can't produce salmon and bread and grain. It's got to do one or the other. And we're now at this moment, we're like, no, I think we can do both if we're smart about it, right? And actually there's value in both having, an agricultural economy and a salmon economy in this watershed. And so we're trying to figure out how to navigate what at the surface level has felt like an oppositional thing, but we can find ways to to navigate through that. And there have been some great examples of that. Water management in the Yakima River Basin has been there's been a lot of work done between the Yakima Nation and irrigators to figure out how to maximize efficiency in management of water, both for the benefit of salmon and then also for the benefit of irrigators who are being pressed by increasing variability of how much water is available. So we're realizing it's to the benefit of all of us to figure out how to do this better. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned salmon many times.
Yeah.
There are wild salmon.
Yes.
And there are hatchery fish.
Very good.
When you were interacting with, particularly the tribes, were they making any distinction between, they want to fish, they want to catch fish. But in my opinion, what we need to be doing is, recovering the wild fish.
Sure.
So were people making a distinction between those fish, those salmon?
That's great. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and one that Eileen addresses quite a bit in her essay. And then visually, there's wild fish in here, there's people working in hatcheries, and that dilemma is certainly front and center in the Columbia River. So I won't speak for indigenous peoples but I will say what I observed, which is that that everybody wants fish to eat, and everybody wants a sustainable fish population that's independent of people producing fish. Right? That is a shared goal, and it's also recognized that because of past choices, without hatcheries in the river system today, many indigenous people's, treaty right to be able to harvest fish would just go away overnight. And so at the same time, many indigenous hatcheries run by indigenous people are focusing not just on producing fish for sustenance, but on restoring native fish populations. And there's a number of things going on actually in this watershed, specifically around using hatcheries to recover wild populations of fish. So there's been a real evolution in how we think about hatcheries. Hatcheries were first introduced into the Columbia River system to replace lost wild salmon. Right, so we're going to put a dam in, and that's going to get rid of all of this spawning habitat for salmon, but we'll replace that by putting a hatchery in below the dam. So we don't need that spawning habitat. Right, we'll just produce fish at this hatchery, they'll go out to the ocean, they'll come back, we can catch fish, it's great. And we realize there's all sorts of problems with that. And to some degree, there are places where hatcheries are still doing just that. But there's also many hatcheries where they're being used to take genetic stock out of the wild, produce more fish, put them back into the wild to release them, and successfully recovering fish to streams that have had their fish extirpated. And the conflict there between settler colonial conservation groups that are just interested in wild fish and folks and indigenous folks that are interested in using hatcheries for recovery of fish has been, I'd say, something that I feel like we're moving towards a place of, again, resolution and finding common ground on. But it's a complicated and tricky one. And I will say that we definitely all need to be pulling in the same direction on this if there's going to be fish in the future. And so it's an important conversation for us to have and finding common ground on. So the other thing I'll just say from my own experience, having been involved with conservation in this region for many years on a variety of levels, is that I have learned that approaching indigenous perspectives on how to go about conservation with humility is not just wise as far as building relationships, but wise as far as actually getting things done well. And there are many perspectives that we have had. Settler colonial ideas of conservation are still rooted in settler colonial philosophies about how the world works. that have created the problems that we are now trying to unpack. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in stepping back and watching how indigenous peoples are approaching conservation and maybe taking a lead in supporting their work rather than saying, that's not how I think we should do it. And just taking a step back and approaching that with humility, I think, has been to the benefit of many conservation projects that I've had the chance to document. So, not just with salmon. Yeah.
I read a book, it was decades ago, called, I think, Kayaking Alone. It was a 900-mile journey from a whitewater kayak through Idaho, and then a saltwater kayak.
Okay.
Have you read it?
No.
I just looked it up in the phone dive, but so in the wheat farmers using barges, and it was a journalist trying to see all the different constituencies.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder too, I don't know how many dams, if any, have been taken out, do you know?
I mean, no significant dams have been removed from the Columbia River system. I'm sure there's some small, tributaries but there's a lot of conversations. The Similkameen Dam the Enlow Dam which is in the Okanagan watershed. That, I think, will come out in the next decade, almost certainly. And there's a lot of conversations about the Snake River dams. One of the stories that's in the book, you saw some photos of solar panels. The Nez Perce tribe in Idaho is working on producing enough power by solar on their reservation and in collaborating with other reservations in the region, that they will replace all of the power produced by the Snake River dams with solar power, to basically we've replaced all this hydropower, so that is no longer a talking point for why we need to maintain these dams. So that was an interesting, just creative way to think about how do we address that. Do we need power? Yes. Does it need to come from those dams? Not necessarily. So I think that's a really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stories like that going on. There's also interesting research. A big talking point for hydropower is that it's carbon neutral. It's carbon neutral. We're not burning fossil fuels to produce it, but that's actually not true, because reservoirs produce actually a lot of greenhouse gases. In terms of anaerobic decomposition of materials under the water and methane production. And so having a better accounting for what the real costs of these dams are will help us make better choices moving forward. So, yeah. I'll take a couple more questions here. Yeah, please.
If you could do one thing to change what is, what would you do?
If I could do one thing to change what is,
Yes.
like for the future?
Regarding the Columbia Basin.
Regarding the Columbia River? Yeah, I mean, I think a comprehensive and collaborative plan for managing water. Well, not managing water, managing people's relationship to water really is what I think about it, that takes into account ecological services and ecological function. I think when if we did our accounting better, if we thought about all of the value that healthy watersheds provide to us, it'd become pretty clear the choices we should make, not just personally or like spiritually, but economically. I think the value of healthy watersheds, if we had a clear-eyed accounting for it, would become very easy politically to make choices that protected, functioning watersheds. So I would love to see that happen. And I think a lot of things would follow from that. Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, I'll do one more question here.
Yeah, maybe this didn't come up in conversations with people enough to be able to answer this, but did you get a sense that people, particularly I'll say in like rural areas where climate change politically may not be as accepted, did you get a sense that they were experiencing that the watershed was changing, that like the climate was changing and the watershed was changing, or that it would, like an awareness that it would in the future and it would impact?
There's no place I've visited in the watershed, either as a photographer and researcher doing this book or as a storyteller coming and sharing these, where people weren't extremely aware that we are in a state of massive change ecologically. And that's ranchers out in the desert and fishermen at the mouth of the river and, you know, orchardists in the Okanagan and indigenous people at the headwaters of the river. Everyone knows that something's changing. And the political speak about whether or not climate change is happening, maybe some of those people will vote that way, but on a personal level, we all understand that what was is not what will be, and what is cannot stay, right? That things need to change, and there's a lot of anxiety about that, there's a lot of hope about that, there's a lot of conversation about that, but I think we're all aware that we are going someplace new, and there's a lot of fear, I think, from rural peoples that something will be placed on top of them. I think it's an important thing for us to recognize in the settler colonial context that that the power dynamics are shifting, right? And decisions are being made in ways that are going to affect people, and not just their livelihood, but their cultural relationship to the landscape. That's clearly true for indigenous peoples. It's happened. It's happening again. But it's also true for rural people, you know, so it's not 500 generations, it's 4 generations, but it's still a cultural relationship with the landscape that's changing, and we need to be sensitive for all of these different cultural perspectives and take that into account as we're figuring out a way forward to care for those different cultural relationships with the land. So, good. Well, I'll answer more questions back there, and I would love to sign your book. I will also say that I just heard that 2 boxes of these books are going to DC to decision makers with Save Our Wild Salmon, and so I'm really excited for the possibilities of this. So you probably need a copy, but maybe somebody else you know needs a copy as well. So yeah, I hope to see this book really support your guys' learning and engagement and people in your community as well. Thanks so much for having me out. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dave. That was great, and thank you everybody for coming again. I hope you enjoyed the program, and hope to see you again at another WRI program. 2 things really quick. I'm going to pull up that QR code if you have a second. I'd really appreciate any feedback you have. And the second thing is the porch light is out, so please be careful walking out in the dark. But otherwise, everybody get home safe and have a great rest of your night. Does it make it out?